The Moon and Sixpence XLV. I have said already that, but for the hazard of a journey to Tahiti, I should doubtless never have written this book. It is thither that after many wanderings Charles Strickland came, and it is there that he painted the pictures on which his fame most securely rests. I suppose no artist achieves completely the realization of the dream that obsesses him, and Strickland, harassed incessantly by his struggle with technique, managed, perhaps, less than others to express the vision that he saw with his mind's eye, but in Tahiti the circumstances were favorable to him. He found in his surroundings the accidents necessary for his inspiration to become effective, and his later pictures give at least a suggestion of what he sought. They offer the imagination something new and strange. It is as though in this far country his spirit, that had wandered disembodied, seeking a tenement, at last was able to clothe itself in flesh. To use the hackneyed phrase, here he found himself. It would seem natural that my visit to this remote island should immediately revive my interest in Strickland, but the work I was engaged in occupied my attention to the exclusion of whatever was irrelevant, and it was not till I'd been there some days that I even remembered his connection with it. After all, I had not seen him for 15 years, and it was 9 since he died. But I think my arrival at Tahiti would have driven out of my head matters of much more immediate importance to me, and even after a week I found it not easy to order myself soberly. I remember that on my first morning I awoke early, and when I came onto the terrace of the hotel no one was stirring. I wandered round to the kitchen, but it was locked, and on a bench outside a native boy was sleeping. There seemed no chance of breakfast for some time, so I sauntered down to the waterfront. The Chinamen were already busy in their shops. The sky had still the pallor of dawn, and there was a ghostly silence on the lagoon. 10 miles away the island of Murea, like some high fastness of the Holy Grail, guarded its mystery. I did not altogether believe my eyes. The days that had passed since I left Wellington seemed extraordinary and unusual. Wellington is trim and neat and English. It reminds you of a seaport town on the south coast. And for 3 days afterwards the sea was stormy. Gray clouds chased one another across the sky. Then the wind dropped, and the sea was calm and blue. The Pacific is more desolate than other seas. Its spaces seem more vast, and the most ordinary journey upon it has somehow the feeling of an adventure. The air you breathe is an elixir which prepares you for the unexpected. Nor is it vouchsafed to man in the flesh to know aught that more nearly suggests the golden realms of fancy than the approach to Tahiti. Murea, the sister isle, comes into view in rocky splendor, rising from the desert sea mysteriously, like the unsubstantial fabric of a magic wand. With its jagged outline, it is like a Montserrat of the Pacific, and you may imagine that their Polynesian nights guard with strange rites mysteries unholy for men to know. The beauty of the island is unveiled as diminishing distance shows you in distincter shape its lovely peaks, but it keeps its secret as you sail by, and, darkly inviolable, seems to fold itself together in a stony, inaccessible grimness. It would not surprise you if, as you came near seeking for an opening in the reef, it vanished suddenly from your view, and nothing met your gaze but the blue loneliness of the Pacific. Tahiti is a lofty, green island, with deep folds of a darker green, in which you divine silent valleys. There is mystery in their somber depths, down which murmur and plash cool streams, and you feel that in those umbrageous places life from immemorial times has been led according to immemorial ways. Even here is something sad and terrible, but the impression is fleeting and serves only to give a greater acuteness to the enjoyment of the moment. It is like the sadness which you may see in the jester's eyes when a merry company is laughing at his sallies. His lips smile, and his jokes are gayer, because in the communion of laughter he finds himself more intolerably alone. For Tahiti is smiling and friendly. It is like a lovely woman graciously prodigal of her charm and beauty, and nothing can be more conciliatory than the entrance into the harbor at Papeete. The schooners moored to the quay are trim and neat. The little town along the bay is white and urbane, and the flamboyants, scarlet against the blue sky, flaunt their color like a cry of passion. They are sensual with an unashamed violence that leaves you breathless. And the crowd that throngs the wharf as the steamer draws alongside is gay and debonair. It is a noisy, cheerful, gesticulating crowd. It is a sea of brown faces. You have an impression of colored movement against the flaming blue of the sky. Everything is done with a great deal of bustle, the unloading of the baggage, the examination of the customs, and everyone seems to smile at you. It is very hot. The color dazzles you. I had not been in Tahiti long before I met Captain Nichols. He came in one morning when I was having breakfast on the terrace of the hotel and introduced himself. He had heard that I was interested in Charles Strickland and announced that he was come to have a talk about him. They are as fond of gossip in Tahiti as in an English village, and 1 or 2 inquiries I had made for pictures by Strickland had been quickly spread. I asked the stranger if he had breakfasted. "Yes, I had my coffee early," he answered, but I don't mind having a drop of whiskey. I called the Chinese boy. You don't think it's too early? Said the captain. I'm practically a teetotaler, he said, as he poured himself out a good half-tumbler of Canadian Club. When he smiled, he showed broken and discolored teeth. He was a very lean man, of no more than average height, with gray hair cut short and a stubby gray mustache. He had not shaved for a couple of days. His face was deeply lined, burned brown by long exposure to the sun, and he had a pair of small blue eyes which were astonishingly shifty. They moved quickly, following my smallest gesture, and gave him the look of a very thorough rogue. But at the moment he was all heartiness and good fellowship. He was dressed in a bedraggled suit of khaki, and his hands would have been all the better for a wash. I knew Strickland well, he said, as he leaned back in his chair and lit the cigar I had offered him. It's through me he came out to the islands. Where did you meet him? I asked. In Marseilles. What were you doing there? He gave me an ingratiating smile. Well, I guess I was on the beach. My friend's appearance suggested that he was now in the same predicament, and I prepared myself to cultivate an agreeable acquaintance. The society of beachcombers always repays the small pains you need be at to enjoy it. They are easy of approach and affable in conversation. They seldom put on airs, and the offer of a drink is a sure way to their hearts. You need no laborious steps to enter upon familiarity with them, and you can earn not only their confidence, but their gratitude by turning an attentive ear to their discourse. They look upon conversation as the great pleasure of life, thereby proving the excellence of their civilization, and for the most part they are entertaining talkers. The extent of their experience is pleasantly balanced by the fertility of their imagination. It cannot be said that they are without guile, but they have a tolerant respect for the law, when the law is supported by strength. It is hazardous to play poker with them, but their ingenuity adds a peculiar excitement to the best game in the world. I came to know Captain Nichols very well before I left Tahiti, and I am the richer for his acquaintance. I do not consider that the cigars and whiskey he consumed at my expense. He always refused cocktails, since he was practically a teetotaler, and the few dollars, borrowed with a civil air of conferring a favor upon me, that passed from my pocket to his, were in any way equivalent to the entertainment he afforded me. I remained his debtor. I should be sorry if my conscience, insisting on a rigid attention to the matter in hand, forced me to dismiss him in a couple of lines. I do not know why Captain Nichols first left England. It was a matter upon which he was reticent, and with persons of his kidney a direct question is never very discreet. He hinted at undeserved misfortune, and there is no doubt that he looked upon himself as the victim of injustice. My fancy played with the various forms of fraud and violence, and I agreed with him sympathetically when he remarked that the authorities in the old country were so damn technical. But it was nice to see that any unpleasantness he had endured in his native land had not impaired his ardent patriotism. He frequently declared that England was the finest country in the world, sir, and he felt a lively superiority over Americans, colonials, Dagos, Dutchmen, and Kanakas. But I do not think he was a happy man. He suffered from dyspepsia, and he might often be seen sucking a tablet of pepsin. In the morning his appetite was poor, but this affliction alone would hardly have impaired his spirits. He had a greater cause of discontent with life than this. 8 years before he had rashly married a wife. There are men whom a merciful providence has undoubtedly ordained to a single life, but who from willfulness or through circumstances they could not cope with have flown in the face of its decrees. There is no object more deserving of pity than the married bachelor. Of such was Captain Nichols. I met his wife. She was a woman of 28, I should think, though of a type whose age is always doubtful, for she cannot have looked different when she was 20, and at 40 would look no older. She gave me an impression of extraordinary tightness. Her plain face with its narrow lips was tight, her skin was stretched tightly over her bones, her smile was tight, her hair was tight, her clothes were tight, and the white drill she wore had all the effect of black bombazine. I could not imagine why Captain Nichols had married her, and having married her, why he had not deserted her. Perhaps he had, often, and his melancholy arose from the fact that he could never succeed. However far he went, and in howsoever secret a place he hid himself, I felt sure that Mrs. Nichols, inexorable as fate and remorseless as conscience, would presently rejoin him. He could as little escape her as the cause can escape the effect. The rogue, like the artist and perhaps the gentleman, belongs to no class. He is not embarrassed by the sans-gene of the hobo, nor put out of countenance by the etiquette of the prince. But Mrs. Nichols belonged to the well-defined class, of late become vocal, which is known as the lower middle. Her father, in fact, was a policeman. I am certain that he was an efficient one. I do not know what her hold was on the captain, but I do not think it was love. I never heard her speak, but it may be that in private she had a copious conversation. At any rate, Captain Nichols was frightened to death of her. Sometimes, sitting with me on the terrace of the hotel, he would become conscious that she was walking in the road outside. She did not call him. She gave no sign that she was aware of his existence. She merely walked up and down composedly. Then a strange uneasiness would seize the captain. He would look at his watch and sigh. "Well, I must be off," he said. Neither wit nor whiskey could detain him then. Yet he was a man who had faced undaunted hurricane and typhoon, and would not have hesitated to fight a dozen unarmed niggers with nothing but a revolver to help him. Sometimes Mrs. Nichols would send her daughter, a pale-faced, sullen child of 7, to the hotel. "Mother wants you," she said in a whining tone. "Very well, my dear," said Captain Nichols. He rose to his feet at once, and accompanied his daughter along the road. I suppose it was a very pretty example of the triumph of spirit over matter, and so my digression has at least the advantage of a moral. I have tried to put some connection into the various things Captain Nichols told me about Strickland, and I here set them down in the best order I can. How he had passed the intervening months, I do not know, but life must have been very hard, for Captain Nichols saw him first in the Asile de Newt. There was a strike at Marseilles at the time, and Strickland, having come to the end of his resources, had apparently found it impossible to earn the small sum he needed to keep body and soul together. The Asile de Newt is a large stone building where pauper and vagabond may get a bed for a week, provided their papers are in order and they can persuade the friars in charge that they are working men. Captain Nichols noticed Strickland for his size and his singular appearance among the crowd that waited for the doors to open. They waited listlessly, some walking to and fro, some leaning against the wall, and others seated on the curb with their feet in the gutter. And when they filed into the office, he heard the monk who read his papers address him in English. But he did not have a chance to speak to him, since, as he entered the common room, a monk came in with a huge Bible in his arms, mounted a pulpit which was at the end of the room, and began the service which the wretched outcast had to endure as the price of their lodging. He and Strickland were assigned to different rooms, and when, thrown out of bed at 5 in the morning by a stalwart monk, he had made his bed and washed his face, Strickland had already disappeared. Captain Nichols wandered about the streets for an hour of bitter cold, and then made his way to the place Victor Gelu, where the sailormen are wont to congregate. Dozing against the pedestal of a statue, he saw Strickland again. He gave him a kick to awaken him. "Coming out breakfast, mate," he said. "Go to hell," answered Strickland. I recognized my friend's limited vocabulary, and I prepared to regard Captain Nichols as a trustworthy witness. "Busted?" asked the captain. "Blast you," answered Strickland. "Come along with me. I'll get you some breakfast." After a moment's hesitation, Strickland scrambled to his feet, and together they went to the Bouchée de Pain, where the hungry are given a wedge of bread, which they must eat there and then, for it is forbidden to take it away, and then to the Couleur de Soup, where for a week at 11 and 4, you may get a bowl of thin, salt soup. The two buildings are placed far apart, so that only the starving should be tempted to make use of them. So they had breakfast, and so began the queer companionship of Charles Strickland and Captain Nichols. They must have spent something like 4 months at Marseilles in one another's society. Their career was devoid of adventure, if by adventure you mean unexpected or thrilling incident, for their days were occupied in the pursuit of enough money to get a night's lodging and such food as would stay the pangs of hunger. But I wish I could give here the pictures, colored and racy, which Captain Nichols' vivid narrative offered to the imagination. His account of their discoveries in the low life of Seaport Town would have made a charming book, and in the various characters that came their way the student might easily have found matter for a very complete dictionary of rogues. But I must content myself with a few paragraphs. I received the impression of a life intense and brutal, savage, multicolored, and vivacious. It made the Marseilles that I knew gesticulating and sunny, with its comfortable hotels and its restaurants crowded with the well-to-do, tame, and commonplace. I envied men who had seen with their own eyes the sights that Captain Nichols described. When the doors of the Asile de Newt were closed to them, Strickland and Captain Nichols sought the hospitality of Tough Bill. This was the master of a sailor's boarding house, a huge mulatto with a heavy fist, who gave a stranded mariner food and shelter till he found him a berth. They lived with him a month, sleeping with a dozen others, Swedes, Negroes, Brazilians, on the floor of the 2 bare rooms in his house, which he assigned to his charges. And every day they went with him to the place Victor Gelu, whither came ship's captains in search of a man. He was married to an American woman, obese and slatternly, fallen to this pass by heaven knows what process of degradation, and every day the boarders took it in turns to help her with the housework. Captain Nichols looked upon it as a smart piece of work on Strickland's part that he had got out of this by painting a portrait of Tough Bill. Tough Bill not only paid for the canvas, colors, and brushes, but gave Strickland a pound of smuggled tobacco into the bargain. For all I know, this picture may still adorn the parlor of the tumble-down little house somewhere near the Quai de la Joliette, and I suppose it could now be sold for £1,500. Strickland's idea was to ship on some vessel bound for Australia or New Zealand, and from there make his way to Samoa or Tahiti. I do not know how he had come upon the notion of going to the South Seas, though I remember that his imagination had long been haunted by an island, all green and sunny, encircled by a sea more blue than is found in northern latitudes. I suppose that he clung to Captain Nichols because he was acquainted with those parts, and it was Captain Nichols who persuaded him that he would be more comfortable in Tahiti. You see, Tahiti's French, he explained to me, and the French aren't so damned technical. I thought I saw his point. Strickland had no papers, but that was not a matter to disconcert Tough Bill when he saw profit. He took the first month's wages of the sailor for whom he found a berth, and he provided Strickland with those of an English stoker who had providentially died on his hands. But both Captain Nichols and Strickland were bound east, and it chanced that the only opportunities for signing on were with ships sailing west. Twice Strickland refused a berth on tramps sailing for the United States, and once on a collier going to Newcastle. Tough Bill had no patience with an obstinacy which could only result in loss to himself, and on the last occasion he flung both Strickland and Captain Nichols out of his house without more ado. They found themselves once more adrift. Tough Bill's fare was seldom extravagant, and you rose from his table almost as hungry as you sat down, but for some days they had good reason to regret it. They learned what hunger was. The colère de soup and the asile de newt were both closed to them, and their only sustenance was the wedge of bread which the bêche de pain provided. They slept where they could, sometimes in an empty truck on a siding near the station, sometimes in a cart behind a warehouse. But it was bitterly cold, and after an hour or two of uneasy dozing they would tramp the streets again. What they felt the lack of most bitterly was tobacco, and Captain Nichols, for his part, could not do without it. He took to hunting the Kino beer for cigarette ends and the butt ends of cigars which the promenaders of the night before had thrown away. I've tasted worse smoking mixtures in a pipe, he added with a philosophic shrug of his shoulders as he took a couple of cigars from the case I offered him, putting one in his mouth and the other in his pocket. Now and then they made a bit of money. Sometimes a mail steamer would come in, and Captain Nichols, having scraped acquaintance with the timekeeper, would succeed in getting the pair of them a job as stevedores. When it was an English boat, they would dodge into the forecastle and get a hearty breakfast from the crew. There's no harm in a kick in the hindquarters when your belly's full, said Captain Nichols, and personally I never taken bad part. An officer's got to think about discipline. I had a lively picture of Captain Nichols flying headlong down a narrow gangway before the uplifted foot of an angry mate, and, like a true Englishman, rejoicing in the spirit of the mercantile marine. There were often odd jobs to be got about the fish market. Once they each of them earned a franc by loading trucks with innumerable boxes of oranges that had been dumped down on the quay. One day, they had a stroke of luck. One of the boarding masters got a contract to paint a tramp that had come in from Madagascar around the Cape of Good Hope, and they spent several days on a plank hanging over the side, covering the rusty hull with paint. It was a situation that must have appealed to Strickland's sardonic humor. I asked Captain Nichols how he bore himself during these hardships. Never knew him say a cross word, answered the captain. He'd be a bit surly sometimes, but when we hadn't a bite since morning, and we hadn't even got the price of a lie down to the chinks, he'd be as lively as a cricket. I was not surprised at this. Strickland was just a man to rise superior to circumstances, when they were such as to occasion despondency in most. But whether this was due to equanimity of soul or to contradictoriness, it would be difficult to say. The Chink's Head was the name the beachcombers gave to a wretched and off-the-roof outiery, kept by a one-eyed Chinaman, where for 6 sous you could sleep in a cot, and for 3 on the floor. Here they made friends with others in as desperate condition as themselves, and when they were penniless and the night was bitter cold, they were glad to borrow from anyone who had earned a stray franc during the day the price of a roof over their heads. They were not niggardly, these tramps, and he who had money did not hesitate to share it among the rest. They belonged to all the countries in the world, but this was no bar to good fellowship, for they felt themselves freemen of a country whose frontiers include them all, the great country of Cockaigne. But I guess Strickland was an ugly customer when he was roused, said Captain Nichols, reflectively. One day we ran into Tough Bill in the place, and he asked Charlie for the papers he'd given him. You'd better come and take them if you want them, says Charlie. He was a powerful fellow, Tough Bill, but he didn't quite like the look of Charlie, so he began cursing him. He called him pretty near every name he could lay hands on, and when Tough Bill began cursing it was worth listening to him. Well, Charlie stuck it for a bit. Then he stepped forward and he just said, "Get out, you bloody swine." It wasn't so much what he said, but the way he said it. Tough Bill never spoke another word. You could see him go yellow, and he walked away as if he'd remembered he had a date. Strickland, according to Captain Nichols, did not use exactly the words I have given. But since this book is meant for family reading, I have thought it better, at the expense of truth, to put into his mouth expressions familiar to the domestic circle. Now, Tough Bill was not the man to put up with humiliation at the hands of common sailor. His power depended on his prestige, and first one, then another, of the sailors who lived in his house told them that he had sworn to do Strickland in. One night, Captain Nichols and Strickland were sitting in one of the bars of the Rue Bout Erie. The Rue Bout Erie is a narrow street of one-stored houses, each house consisting of but one room. They are like booths in a crowded fair or the cages of animals in a circus. At every door you see a woman. Some lean lazily against the side posts, humming to themselves or calling to the passerby in a raucous voice, and some listlessly read. They are French, Italian, Spanish, Japanese, colored. Some are fat and some are thin. And under the thick paint on their faces, the heavy smears on their eyebrows, and the scarlet of their lips, you see the lines of age and the scars of dissipation. Some wear black shifts and flesh-colored stockings. Some with curly hair, dyed yellow, are dressed like little girls in short muslin frocks. Through the open door you see a red-tiled floor, a large wooden bed, and on a deal table a ewer and a basin. A motley crowd saunters along the street. Lascars off, AP, and blonde Northmen from a Swedish bark, Japanese from a man of war, English sailors, Spaniards, pleasant-looking fellows from a French cruiser, Negroes off an American tramp. By day, it is merely sordid, but at night, lit only by the lamps in the little huts, the street has a sinister beauty. The hideous lust that pervades the air is oppressive and horrible, and yet there is something mysterious in the sight which haunts and troubles you. You feel I know not what primitive force which repels and yet fascinates you. Here all the decencies of civilization are swept away, and you feel that men are face to face with a somber reality. There's an atmosphere that is at once intense and tragic. In the bar in which Strickland and Nichols sat, a mechanical piano was loudly grinding out dance music. Round a room, people were sitting at tables. Here, half a dozen sailors uproariously drunk. There a group of soldiers. And in the middle, crowded together, couples were dancing. Bearded sailors with brown faces and large horny hands clasped their partners in a tight embrace. The women wore nothing but a shift. Now and then 2 sailors would get up and dance together. The noise was deafening. People were singing, shouting, laughing. And when a man gave a long kiss to the girl sitting on his knees, catcalls from the English sailors increased the din. The air was heavy with the dust beaten up by the heavy boots of the men, and gray with smoke. It was very hot. Behind the bar was seated a woman nursing her baby. The waiter, an undersized youth with a flat, spotty face, hurried to and fro carrying a tray laden with glasses of beer. In a little while, Tough Bill, accompanied by 2 huge Negroes, came in, and it was easy to see that he was already 3 parts drunk. He was looking for trouble. He lurched against a table at which 3 soldiers were sitting and knocked over a glass of beer. There was an angry altercation, and the owner of the bar stepped forward and ordered Tough Bill to go. He was a hefty fellow, in the habit of standing no nonsense from his customers, and Tough Bill hesitated. The landlord was not a man he cared to tackle, for the police were on his side, and with an oath he turned on his heel. Suddenly he caught sight of Strickland. He rolled up to him. He did not speak. He gathered the spittle in his mouth and spat full in Strickland's face. Strickland seized his glass and flung it at him. The dancer stopped suddenly still. There was an instant of complete silence, but when Tough Bill threw himself on Strickland, the lust of battle seized them all, and in a moment there was a confused scrimmage. Tables were overturned, glasses crashed to the ground. There was a hellish row. The women scattered to the door and behind the bar. Passers-by surged in from the street. You heard curses in every tongue, the sound of blows, cries, and in the middle of the room a dozen men were fighting with all their might. On a sudden the police rushed in, and everyone who could made for the door. When the bar was more or less cleared, Tough Bill was lying insensible on the floor with a great gash in his head. Captain Nichols dragged Strickland, bleeding from a wound in his arm, his clothes in rags, into the street. His own face was covered with blood from a blow on the nose. "I guess you'd better get out of Marseilles before Tough Bill comes out of hospital," he said to Strickland when they had got back to the Chink's Head and were cleaning themselves. "This beats cockfighting," said Strickland. I could see his sardonic smile. Captain Nichols was anxious. He knew Tough Bill's vindictiveness. Strickland had downed the mulatto twice, and the mulatto, sober, was a man to be reckoned with. He would bide his time stealthily. He would be in no hurry, but one night Strickland would get a knife thrust in his back, and in a day or 2 the corpse of a nameless beachcomber would be fished out of the dirty water of the harbor. Nichols went next evening to Tough Bill's house and made inquiries. He was in hospital still, but his wife, who had been to see him, said he was swearing hard to kill Strickland when they let him out. A week passed. "That's what I always say," reflected Captain Nichols. "When you hurt a man, hurt him bad. It gives you a bit of time to look about and think what you'll do next." And Strickland had a bit of luck. A ship bound for Australia had sent to the sailors' home for a stoker in place of one who had thrown himself overboard off Gibraltar in an attack of delirium tremens. "You double down to the harbor, my lad," said the captain to Strickland, "and sign on. You got your papers." Strickland set off at once, and that was the last Captain Nichols saw of him. The ship was only in port for 6 hours, and in the evening Captain Nichols watched the vanishing smoke from her funnels as she plowed east through the wintry sea. I have narrated all this as best I could, because I like the contrast of these episodes with the life that I had seen Strickland live in Ashley Gardens when he was occupied with stocks and shares. But I am aware that Captain Nichols was an outrageous liar, and I dare say there is not a word of truth in anything he told me. I should not be surprised to learn that he had never seen Strickland in his life, and owed his knowledge of Marseilles to the pages of a magazine. The Moon and Sixpence XLVII. It is here that I purpose to end my book. My first idea was to begin it with the account of Strickland's last years in Tahiti and with his horrible death, and then to go back and relate what I knew of his beginnings. This I meant to do, not from willfulness, but because I wished to leave Strickland setting out with I know not what fancies in his lonely soul for the unknown islands which fired his imagination. I saw him, the sea gray under the mistral and foam-flecked, watching the vanishing coast of France, which he was destined never to see again, and I thought there was something gallant in his bearing and dauntless in his soul. I wished so to end on a note of hope. It seemed to emphasize the unconquerable spirit of man, but I could not manage it. Somehow I could not get into my story, and after trying once or twice I had to give it up. I started from the beginning in the usual way, and made up my mind I could only tell what I knew of Strickland's life in the order in which I learned the facts. Those that I have now are fragmentary. I am in the position of a biologist who from a single bone must reconstruct not only the appearance of an extinct animal, but its habits. Strickland made no particular impression on the people who came in contact with him in Tahiti. To them, he was no more than a beachcomber in constant need of money, remarkable only for the peculiarity that he painted pictures which seemed to them absurd. And it was not till he had been dead for some years, and agents came from the dealers in Paris and Berlin to look for any pictures which might still remain on the island, that they had any idea that among them had dwelt a man of consequence. They remembered then that they could have bought for a song canvases which now were worth large sums, and they could not forgive themselves for the opportunity which had escaped them. There was a Jewish trader called Cohen, who had come by one of Strickland's pictures in a singular way. He was a little old Frenchman, with soft kind eyes and a pleasant smile, half trader and half seaman, who owned a cutter in which he wandered boldly among the Paumotus and the Marquesas, taking out trade goods and bringing back copra, shell, and pearls. I went to see him because I was told he had a large black pearl which he was willing to sell cheaply, and when I discovered that it was beyond my means, I began to talk to him about Strickland. He had known him well. You see, I was interested in him because he was a painter, he told me. We don't get many painters in the islands, and I was sorry for him because he was such a bad one. I gave him his first job. I had a plantation on the peninsula, and I wanted a white overseer. You never get any work out of the natives unless you have a white man over them. I said to him, "You'll have plenty of time for painting, and you can earn a bit of money." I knew he was starving, but I offered him good wages. I can't imagine that he was a very satisfactory overseer, I said, smiling. I made allowances. I have always had a sympathy for artists. It is in our blood, you know. But he only remained a few months. When he had enough money to buy paints and canvases, he left me. The place had got hold of him by then, and he wanted to get away into the bush. But I continued to see him now and then. He would turn up in Papeete every few months and stay a little while. He'd get money out of someone or other and then disappear again. It was on one of these visits that he came to me and asked for the loan of 200 francs. He looked as if he hadn't had a meal for a week, and I hadn't the heart to refuse him. Of course, I never expected to see my money again. Well, a year later he came to see me once more, and he brought a picture with him. He did not mention the money he owed me, but he said, "Here is a picture of your plantation that I've painted for you." I looked at it. I did not know what to say, but of course I thanked him, and when he had gone away, I showed it to my wife. "What was it like?" I asked. "Do not ask me. I cannot make head or tail of it. I never saw such a thing in my life. What shall we do with it?" I said to my wife. "We can never hang it up," she said. "People would laugh at us." So she took it into an attic and put it away with all sorts of rubbish, for my wife can never throw anything away. It is her mania. Then, imagine to yourself, just before the war my brother wrote to me from Paris and said, "Do you know anything about an English painter who lived in Tahiti? It appears that he was a genius, and his pictures fetch large prices. See if you can lay your hands on anything and send it to me. There's money to be made." So I said to my wife, "What about that picture that Strickland gave me? Is it possible that it is still in the attic?" "Without doubt," she answered, "for you know that I never throw anything away. It is my mania." We went up to the attic, and there, among I know not what rubbish that had been gathered during the 30 years we have inhabited that house, was the picture. I looked at it again, and I said, "Who would have thought that the overseer of my plantation on the peninsula, to whom I lent 200 francs, had genius? Do you see anything in the picture?" "No," she said. "It does not resemble the plantation, and I have never seen coconuts with blue leaves. But they are mad in Paris, and it may be that your brother will be able to sell it for the 200 francs you lent Strickland." Well, we packed it up, and we sent it to my brother. And at last I received a letter from him. What do you think he said? "I received your picture," he said, and I confess, I thought it was a joke that you had played on me. I would not have given the cost of postage for the picture. I was half afraid to show it to the gentleman who had spoken to me about it. Imagine my surprise when he said it was a masterpiece and offered me 30,000 francs. I dare say he would have paid more, but frankly I was so taken aback that I lost my head. I accepted the offer before I was able to collect myself. Then Monsieur Cohen said an admirable thing. I wish that poor Strickland had been still alive. I wonder what he would have said when I gave him 29,800 francs for his picture. I lived at the Hotel de la Fleur, and Mrs. Johnson, the proprietress, had a sad story to tell of lost opportunity. After Strickland's death, certain of his effects were sold by auction in the marketplace at Papeete, and she went to it herself because there was among the truck an American stove she wanted. She paid 27 francs for it. There were a dozen pictures, she told me, but they were unframed and nobody wanted them. Some of them sold for as much as 10 francs, but mostly they went for 5 or 6. Just think, if I had bought them, I should be a rich woman now. But T.R. Johnson would never under any circumstances have been rich. She cannot keep money. The daughter of a native and an English sea captain settled in Tahiti. When I knew her, she was a woman of 50, who looked older and of enormous proportions. Tall and extremely stout, she would have been of imposing presence if the great good nature of her face had not made it impossible for her to express anything but kindliness. Her arms were like legs of mutton, her breasts like giant cabbages. Her face, broad and fleshy, gave you an impression of almost indecent nakedness, and vast chin succeeded to vast chin. I do not know how many of them there were. They fell away voluminously into the capaciousness of her bosom. She was dressed usually in a pink Mother Hubbard, and she wore all day long a large straw hat. But when she let down her hair, which she did now and then, for she was vain of it, you saw that it was long and dark and curly, and her eyes had remained young and vivacious. Her laughter was the most catching I ever heard. It would begin a low peal in her throat and would grow louder and louder till her whole vast body shook. She loved 3 things: a joke, a glass of wine, and a handsome man. To have known her is a privilege. She was the best cook on the island, and she adored good food. From morning till night you saw her sitting on a low chair in the kitchen, surrounded by a Chinese cook and 2 or 3 native girls, giving her orders, chatting sociably with all and sundry, and tasting the savory messes she devised. When she wished to do honor to a friend, she cooked the dinner with her own hands. Hospitality was a passion with her, and there was no one on the island who need go without a dinner when there was anything to eat at the Hotel de la Fleur. She never turned her customers out of her house because they did not pay their bills. She always hoped they would pay when they could. There was one man there who had fallen on adversity, and to him she had given board and lodging for several months. When the Chinese laundryman refused to wash for him without payment, she had sent his things to be washed with hers. She could not allow the poor fellow to go about in a dirty shirt, she said, and since he was a man, and men must smoke, she gave him a franc a day for cigarettes. She used him with the same affability as those of her clients who paid their bills once a week. Age and obesity had made her inapt for love, but she took a keen interest in the amatory affairs of the young. She looked upon venery as the natural occupation for men and women, and was ever ready with precept and example from her own wide experience. I was not 15 when my father found that I had a lover, she said. He was third mate on the Tropic Bird. A good-looking boy. She sighed a little. They say a woman always remembers her first lover with affection, but perhaps she does not always remember him. My father was a sensible man. What did he do? He thrashed me within an inch of my life, and then he made me marry Captain Johnson. I did not mind. He was older, of course, but he was good-looking too. T.R., her father had called her by the name of the white, scented flower which, they tell you, if you have once smelt, will always draw you back to Tahiti in the end, however far you may have roamed. T.R. remembered Strickland very well. He used to come here sometimes, and I used to see him walking about Papeete. I was sorry for him. He was so thin, and he never had any money. When I heard he was in town, I used to send a boy to find him and make him come to dinner with me. I got him a job once or twice, but he couldn't stick to anything. After a little while he wanted to get back to the bush, and one morning he would be gone. Strickland reached Tahiti about 6 months after he left Marseilles. He worked his passage on a sailing vessel that was making the trip from Auckland to San Francisco, and he arrived with a box of paints, an easel, and a dozen canvases. He had a few pounds in his pocket, for he had found work in Sydney, and he took a small room in a native house outside the town. I think the moment he reached Tahiti, he felt himself at home. T.R. told me that he said to her once, "I've been scrubbing the deck, and all at once a chap said to me, 'Why, there it is.' And I looked up and I saw the outline of the island. I knew right away that there was the place I'd been looking for all my life. Then we came near, and I seemed to recognize it. Sometimes when I walk about it, all seems familiar. I could swear I've lived here before. Sometimes it takes them like that, said TR. I've known men come on shore for a few hours while their ship was taking in cargo and never go back. And I've known men who came here to be in an office for a year, and they cursed the place, and when they went away, they took their dying oath they'd hang themselves before they came back again. And in 6 months, you'd see them land once more, and they'd tell you they couldn't live anywhere else. The Moon and Sixpence, I have an idea that some men are born out of their due place. Accident has cast them amid certain surroundings, but they have always a nostalgia for a home they know not. They are strangers in their birthplace, and the leafy lanes they have known from childhood or the populous streets in which they have played remain but a place of passage. They may spend their whole lives aliens among their kindred and remain aloof among the only scenes they have ever known. Perhaps it is this sense of strangeness that sends men far and wide in the search for something permanent to which they may attach themselves. Perhaps some deep-rooted atavism urges the wanderer back to lands which his ancestors left in the dim beginnings of history. Sometimes a man hits upon a place to which he mysteriously feels that he belongs. Here is the home he sought, and he will settle amid scenes that he has never seen before, among men he has never known, as though they were familiar to him from his birth. Here at last he finds rest. I told TR the story of a man I had known at St. Thomas's Hospital. He was a Jew named Abraham, a blond, rather stout young man, shy and very unassuming, but he had remarkable gifts. He entered the hospital with a scholarship, and during the 5 years of the curriculum gained every prize that was open to him. He was made house physician and house surgeon. His brilliance was allowed by all. Finally, he was elected to a position on the staff, and his career was assured. So far as human things can be predicted, it was certain that he would rise to the greatest heights of his profession. Honors and wealth awaited him. Before he entered upon his new duties, he wished to take a holiday, and, having no private means, he went as surgeon on a tramp steamer to the Levant. It did not generally carry a doctor, but one of the senior surgeons at the hospital knew a director of the line, and Abraham was taken as a favor. In a few weeks, the authorities received his resignation of the coveted position on the staff. It created profound astonishment, and wild rumors were current. Whenever a man does anything unexpected, his fellows ascribe it to the most discreditable motives. But there was a man ready to step into Abraham's shoes, and Abraham was forgotten. Nothing more was heard of him. He vanished. It was perhaps 10 years later that one morning on board ship, about to land at Alexandria, I was bidden to line up with the other passengers for the doctor's examination. The doctor was a stout man in shabby clothes, and when he took off his hat I noticed that he was very bald. I had an idea that I had seen him before. Suddenly I remembered. "Abraham," I said. He turned to me with a puzzled look, and then, recognizing me, seized my hand. After expressions of surprise on either side, hearing that I meant to spend the night in Alexandria, he asked me to dine with him at the English Club. When we met again, I declared my astonishment at finding him there. It was a very modest position that he occupied, and there was about him an air of straitened circumstance. Then he told me his story. When he set out on his holiday in the Mediterranean, he had every intention of returning to London and his appointment at St. Thomas's. One morning the tramp docked at Alexandria, and from the deck he looked at the city, white in the sunlight and the crowd on the wharf. He saw the natives in their shabby gabardines, the blacks from the Sudan, the noisy throng of Greeks and Italians, the grave Turks in tarbushes, the sunshine and the blue sky, and something happened to him. He could not describe it. It was like a thunderclap, he said, and then, dissatisfied with this, he said it was like a revelation. Something seemed to twist his heart, and suddenly he felt an exultation, a sense of wonderful freedom. He felt himself at home, and he made up his mind there and then, in a minute, that he would live the rest of his life in Alexandria. He had no great difficulty in leaving the ship, and in 24 hours, with all his belongings, he was on shore. The captain must have thought you was mad as a hatter, I smiled. I didn't care what anybody thought. It wasn't I that acted, but something stronger within me. I thought I would go to a little Greek hotel, while I looked about, and I felt I knew where to find one. And, do you know, I walked straight there, and when I saw it, I recognized it at once. Had you been to Alexandria before? No, I'd never been out of England in my life. Presently, he entered the government service, and there he had been ever since. Have you never regretted it? Never, not for a minute. I earn just enough to live upon, and I'm satisfied. I ask nothing more than to remain as I am till I die. I've had a wonderful life. I left Alexandria next day, and I forgot about Abraham till a little while ago when I was dining with another old friend in the profession, Alec Carmichael, who was in England on short leave. I ran across him in the street and congratulated him on the knighthood with which his eminent services during the war had been rewarded. We arranged to spend an evening together for old times' sake, and when I agreed to dine with him, he proposed that he should ask nobody else so that we could chat without interruption. He had a beautiful old house in Queen and Street, and being a man of taste, he had furnished it admirably. On the walls of the dining room, I saw a charming bellado, and there was a pair of Zophanies that I envied. When his wife, a tall, lovely creature in cloth of gold, had left us, I remarked laughingly on the change in his present circumstances from those when we had both been medical students. We had looked upon it, then, as an extravagance to dine in a shabby Italian restaurant in the Westminster Bridge Road. Now Alec Carmichael was on the staff of half a dozen hospitals. I should think he earned $10,000 a year, and his knighthood was but the first of the honors which must inevitably fall to his lot. "I've done pretty well," he said, "but the strange thing is that I owe it all to one piece of luck." "What do you mean by that?" "Well, do you remember Abraham? He was the man who had the future. When we were students, he beat me all along the line. He got the prizes and the scholarships that I went in for. I always played second fiddle to him. If he kept on, he'd be in the position I'm in now. That man had a genius for surgery. No one had to look in with him. When he was appointed registrar at St. Thomas's, I hadn't a chance of getting on the staff. I should have had to become a GP, and you know what likelihood there is for a GP ever to get out of the common rut. But Abraham fell out, and I got the job. That gave me my opportunity. I dare say that's true. It was just luck. I suppose there was some kink in Abraham. Poor devil, he's gone to the dogs altogether. He's got some two-penny halfpenny job in the medical at Alexandria, sanitary officer or something like that. I'm told he lives with an ugly old Greek woman and has half a dozen scrofulous kids. The fact is, I suppose, that it's not enough to have brains. The thing that counts is character. Abraham hadn't got character. Character? I should have thought it needed a good deal of character to throw up a career after half an hour's meditation, because you saw in another way of living a more intense significance, and it required still more character never to regret the sudden step. But I said nothing, and Alec Carmichael proceeded reflectively. Of course it would be hypocritical for me to pretend that I regret what Abraham did. After all, I've scored by it. He puffed luxuriously at the long Corona he was smoking. But if I weren't personally concerned, I should be sorry at the waste. It seems a rotten thing that a man should make such a hash of life. I wondered if Abraham really had made a hash of life. Is to do what you most want, to live under the conditions that please you, in peace with yourself, to make a hash of life. And is it success to be an eminent surgeon with $10,000 a year and a beautiful wife? I suppose it depends on what meaning you attach to life, the claim which you acknowledge to society, and the claim of the individual. But again, I held my tongue. For who am I to argue with a knight? T.R., when I told her this story, praised my prudence, and for a few minutes we worked in silence, for we were shelling peas. Then her eyes, always alert for the affairs of her kitchen, fell on some action of the Chinese cook which aroused her violent disapproval. She turned on him with a torrent of abuse. The Chink was not backward to defend himself, and a very lively quarrel ensued. They spoke in the native language, of which I had learnt but half a dozen words, and it sounded as though the world would shortly come to an end. But presently peace was restored, and Tar gave the cook a cigarette. They both smoked comfortably. "Do you know, it was I who found him his wife?" said T.R. suddenly, with a smile spread all over her immense face. "The cook? No, Strickland. But he had one already." "That is what he said, but I told him she was in England, and England is at the other end of the world." "True," I replied. "He would come to Papeete every 2 or 3 months when he wanted paints or tobacco or money, and then he would wander about like a lost dog." I was sorry for him. I had a girl here then called Ada to do the rooms. She was some sort of relation of mine, and her father and mother were dead, so I had her to live with me. Strickland used to come here now and then to have a square meal or to play chess with one of the boys. I noticed that she looked at him when he came, and I asked her if she liked him. She said she liked him well enough. You know what these girls are. They're always pleased to go with a white man. "Was she a native?" I asked. "Yes. She hadn't a drop of white blood in her." Well, after I'd talked to her, I sent for Strickland, and I said to him, "Strickland, it's time for you to settle down. A man of your age shouldn't go playing about with the girls down at the front. They're bad lots, and you'll come to no good with them. You've got no money, and you can never keep a job for more than a month or 2. No one will employ you now. You say you can always live in the bush with one or other of the natives, and they're glad to have you because you're a white man, but it's not decent for a white man. Now listen to me, Strickland." T.R. mingled French with English in her conversation, for she used both languages with equal facility. She spoke them with a singing accent, which was not unpleasing. You felt that a bird would speak in these tones if it could speak English. "Now, what do you say to marrying Ada? She's a good girl, and she's only 17. She's never been promiscuous like some of these girls. A captain or first mate, yes, but she's never been touched by a native. Elle se respecte, vois-tu?" The purser of the Oahu told me last journey that he hadn't met a nicer girl in the islands. It's time she settled down, too. And besides, the captains and the first mates like a change now and then. I don't keep my girls too long. She has a bit of property down by Taraveo, just before you come to the peninsula, and with copper at the price it is now, you could live quite comfortably. There's a house, and you'd have all the time you wanted for your painting. What do you say to it? TR paused to take breath. It was then he told me of his wife in England. My poor Strickland, I said to him. They've all got a wife somewhere. That is generally why they come to the islands. Ada is a sensible girl, and she doesn't expect any ceremony before the mayor. She's a Protestant, and, they don't look upon these things like the Catholics. Then he said, but what does Ada say to it? It appears that she has a begin for you, I said. She's willing if you are. Shall I call her? He chuckled in a funny, dry way he had, and I called her. She knew what I was talking about, the hussy, and I saw her out of the corner of my eyes listening with all her ears while she pretended to iron a blouse that she had been washing for me. She came. She was laughing, but I could see that she was a little shy, and Strickland looked at her without speaking. Was she pretty? I asked. Not bad, but you must have seen pictures of her. He painted her over and over again, sometimes with a perio on, and sometimes with nothing at all. Yes, she was pretty enough, and she knew how to cook. I taught her myself. I saw Strickland was thinking of it, so I said to him, I've given her good wages, and she's saved them, and the captains and the first mates she's known have given her a little something now and then. She saved several hundred francs. He pulled his great red beard and smiled. Well, Ada, he said, do you fancy me for a husband? She did not say anything, but just giggled. But I tell you, my poor Strickland, the girl has a begin for you, I said. I shall beat you, he said, looking at her. How else should I know you loved me? She answered. TR broke off her narrative and addressed herself to me reflectively. My first husband, Captain Johnson, used to thrash me regularly. He was a man. He was handsome, 6'3", and when he was drunk, there was no holding him. I would be black and blue all over for days at a time. Oh, I cried when he died. I thought I should never get over it. But it wasn't until I married George Rainey that I knew what I'd lost. You can never tell what a man is like till you live with him. I've never been so deceived in a man as I was in George Rainey. He was a fine, upstanding fellow, too. He was nearly as tall as Captain Johnson, and he looked strong enough, but it was all on the surface. He never drank. He never raised his hand to me. He might have been a missionary. I made love with the officers of every ship that touched at the island, and George Rainey never saw anything. At last I was disgusted with him, and I got a divorce. What was the good of a husband like that? It's a terrible thing the way some men treat women. I condoled with TR and remarked feelingly that men were deceivers ever, then asked her to go on with her story of Strickland. Well, I said to him, there's no hurry about it. Take your time and think it over. Ada has a very nice room in the annex. Live with her for a month and see how you like her. You can have your meals here. And at the end of a month, if you decide you want to marry her, you can just go and settle down on her property. Well, he agreed to that. Ada continued to do the housework, and I gave him his meals as I said I would. I taught Ada how to make 1 or 2 dishes I knew he was fond of. He did not paint much. He wandered about the hills and bathed in the stream. And he sat about the front looking at the lagoon, and at sunset he would go down and look at Muria. He used to go fishing on the reef. He loved to moon about the harbor, talking to the natives. He was a nice, quiet fellow. And every evening after dinner, he would go down to the annex with Ada. I saw he was longing to get away to the bush, and at the end of the month, I asked him what he intended to do. He said if Ada was willing to go, he was willing to go with her. So I gave them a wedding dinner. I cooked it with my own hands. I gave them a pea soup and lobster a la Portuguese, and a curry, and a coconut salad. You've never had one of my coconut salads, have you? I must make you one before you go. And then I made them an ice. We had all the champagne we could drink and liqueurs to follow. Oh, I made up my mind to do things well. And afterwards we danced in the drawing room. I was not so fat then, and I always loved dancing. The drawing room at the Hotel de la Fleur was a small room, with a cottage piano and a suite of mahogany furniture, covered in stamped velvet, neatly arranged around the walls. On round tables were photograph albums, and on the walls enlarged photographs of TR and her first husband, Captain Johnson. Still, though TR was old and fat, on occasion we rolled back the Brussels carpet, brought in the maids and 1 or 2 friends of TRS, and danced, though now to the wheezy music of a gramophone. On the veranda the air was scented with the heavy perfume of the TR, and overhead the Southern Cross shone in a cloudless sky. TR smiled indulgently as she remembered the gaiety of a time long past. We kept it up till 3, and when we went to bed, I don't think anyone was very sober. I had told them they could have my trap to take them as far as the road went, because after that they had a long walk. Ada's property was right away in a fold of the mountain. They started at dawn, and the boy I sent with them didn't come back till next day. Yes, that's how Strickland was married. The Moon and Sixpence, I suppose the next 3 years were the happiest of Strickland's life. Ada's house stood about 8 kilometers from the road that runs round the island, and you went to it along a winding pathway shaded by the luxuriant trees of the tropics. It was a bungalow of unpainted wood, consisting of 2 small rooms, and outside was a small shed that served as a kitchen. There was no furniture except the mats they used as beds and a rocking chair, which stood on the veranda. Bananas with their great ragged leaves, like the tattered habiliments of an empress in adversity, grew close up to the house. There was a tree just behind which bore alligator pears, and all about were the coconuts which gave the land its revenue. Ada's father had planted crotons around his property, and they grew in colored profusion, gay and brilliant. They fenced the land with flame. A mango grew in front of the house, and at the edge of the clearing were two flamboyant, twin trees that challenged the gold of the coconuts with their scarlet flowers. Here Strickland lived, coming seldom to Papeete on the produce of the land. There was a little stream that ran not far away, in which he bathed, and down this on occasion would come a shoal of fish. Then the natives would assemble with spears, and with much shouting would transfix the great startled things as they hurried down to the sea. Sometimes Strickland would go down to the reef, and come back with a basket of small, colored fish that Ada would fry in coconut oil, or with a lobster, and sometimes she would make a savory dish of the great land crabs that scuttled away under your feet. Up the mountain were wild orange trees, and now and then Ada would go with 2 or 3 women from the village and return laden with the green, sweet, luscious fruit. Then the coconuts would be ripe for picking, and her cousins, like all the natives, Ada had a host of relatives, would swarm up the trees and throw down the big ripe nuts. They split them open and put them in the sun to dry. Then they cut out the copra and put it into sacks, and the women would carry it down to the trader at the village by the lagoon, and he would give in exchange for it rice and soap and tinned meat and a little money. Sometimes there would be a feast in the neighborhood, and a pig would be killed. Then they would go and eat themselves sick and dance and sing hymns. But the house was a long way from the village, and the Tahitians are lazy. They love to travel and they love to gossip, but they do not care to walk, and for weeks at a time Strickland and Ada lived alone. He painted and he read, and in the evening, when it was dark, they sat together on the veranda, smoking and looking at the night. Then Ada had a baby, and the old woman who came up to help her through her trouble stayed on. Presently the granddaughter of the old woman came to stay with her, and then a youth appeared. No one quite knew where from or to whom he belonged, but he settled down with them in a happy-go-lucky way, and they all lived together. "Tennis, voilà le Capitaine Bruno," said T.R. one day when I was fitting together what she could tell me of Strickland. He knew Strickland well. He visited him at his house. I saw a middle-aged Frenchman with a big black beard, streaked with gray, a sunburned face, and large, shining eyes. He was dressed in a neat suit of ducks. I had noticed him at luncheon, and Alin, the Chinese boy, told me he had come from the Pomotis on the boat that had that day arrived. T.R. introduced me to him, and he handed me his card, a large card on which was printed René Bruno, and underneath, Capitaine au long cours. We were sitting on a little veranda outside the kitchen, and T.R. was cutting out a dress that she was making for one of the girls about the house. He sat down with us. "Yes, I knew Strickland well," he said. "I'm very fond of chess," and he was always glad of a game. "I come to Tahiti 3 or 4 times a year for my business, and when he was at Papeete, he would come here and we would play." When he married, Captain Bruno smiled and shrugged his shoulders. Enfin, when he went to live with the girl that T.R. gave him, he asked me to go and see him. I was one of the guests at the wedding feast. He looked at T.R., and they both laughed. He did not come much to Papeete after that, and about a year later it chanced that I had to go to that part of the island for I forget what business. And when I had finished it, I said to myself, "Voyons, why should I not go and see that poor Strickland?" I asked 1 or 2 natives if they knew anything about him, and I discovered that he lived not more than 5 kilometers from where I was. So I went. I shall never forget the impression my visit made on me. I live on an atoll, a low island. It is a strip of land surrounding a lagoon, and its beauty is the beauty of the sea and sky, and the varied color of the lagoon, and the grace of the coconut trees. But the place where Strickland lived had the beauty of the Garden of Eden. Ah, I wish I could make you see the enchantment of that spot, a corner hidden away from all the world, with the blue sky overhead and the rich, luxuriant trees. It was a feast of color, and it was fragrant and cool. Words cannot describe that paradise. And here he lived, unmindful of the world, and by the world forgotten. I suppose to European eyes it would have seemed astonishingly sordid. The house was dilapidated and none too clean. When I approached, I saw 3 or 4 natives lying on the veranda. You know how natives love to herd together. There was a young man lying full length, smoking a cigarette, and he wore nothing but a perio. The perio is a long strip of trade cotton, red or blue, stamped with a white pattern. It is worn round the waist and hangs to the knees. A girl of 15, perhaps, was plaiting pandanus leaf to make a hat, and an old woman was sitting on her haunches smoking a pipe. Then I saw Ada. She was suckling a newborn child, and another child, stark naked, was playing at her feet. When she saw me, she called out to Strickland, and he came to the door. He, too, wore nothing but a perio. He was an extraordinary figure, with his red beard and matted hair, and his great hairy chest. His feet were horny and scarred, so that I knew he went always barefoot. He had gone native with a vengeance. He seemed pleased to see me, and told Ada to kill a chicken for our dinner. He took me into the house to show me the picture he was at work on when I came in. In one corner of the room was the bed, and in the middle was an easel with a canvas upon it. Because I was sorry for him, I had bought a couple of his pictures for small sums, and I had sent others to friends of mine in France. And though I had bought them out of compassion, after living with them, I began to like them. Indeed, I found a strange beauty in them. Everyone thought I was mad, but it turns out that I was right. I was his first admirer in the islands. He smiled maliciously at TR, and with lamentations, she told us again the story of how, at the sale of Strickland's effects, she had neglected the pictures, but bought an American stove for 27 francs. Have you the pictures still? I asked. Yes. I'm keeping them till my daughter is of marriageable age, and then I shall sell them. They will be her. Then he went on with the account of his visit to Strickland. I shall never forget the evening I spent with him. I had not intended to stay more than an hour, but he insisted that I should spend the night. I hesitated, for I confess I did not much like the look of the mats on which he proposed that I should sleep, but I shrugged my shoulders. When I was building my house in the Paumotus, I had slept out for weeks on a harder bed than that, with nothing to shelter me but wild shrubs. And as for vermin, my tough skin should be proof against their malice. We went down to the stream to bathe while Ada was preparing the dinner, and after we had eaten we sat on the veranda. We smoked and chatted. The young man had a concertina, and he played the tunes popular on the music halls a dozen years before. They sounded strangely in the tropical night thousands of miles from civilization. I asked Strickland if it did not irk him to live in that promiscuity. No, he said, he liked to have his models under his hand. Presently, after loud yawning, the natives went away to sleep, and Strickland and I were left alone. I cannot describe to you the intense silence of the night. On my island in the Paumotus, there is never at night the complete stillness that there was here. There is the rustle of the myriad animals on the beach, all the little shelled things that crawl about ceaselessly, and there is the noisy scurrying of the land crabs. Now and then in the lagoon you hear the leaping of a fish, and sometimes a hurried, noisy splashing as a brown shark sends all the other fish scampering for their lives. And above all, ceaseless like time, is the dull roar of the breakers on the reef. But here there was not a sound, and the air was scented with the white flowers of the night. It was a night so beautiful that your soul seemed hardly able to bear the prison of the body. You felt that it was ready to be wafted away on the immaterial air, and death bore all the aspect of a beloved friend. TR sighed. Ah, I wish I were 15 again. Then she caught sight of a cat trying to get at a dish of prawns on the kitchen table, and with a dexterous gesture and a lively volley of abuse flung a book at its scampering tail. I asked him if he was happy with Ada. She leaves me alone, he said. She cooks my food and looks after her babies. She does what I tell her. She gives me what I want from a woman. And do you never regret Europe? Do you not yearn sometimes for the light of the streets in Paris or London, the companionship of your friends and equals, for theaters and newspapers, and the rumble of omnibuses on the cobbled pavements? For a long time he was silent. Then he said, I shall stay here till I die. But are you never bored or lonely? I asked. He chuckled. Mon pauvre ami, he said. It is evident that you do not know what it is to be an artist. Capitaine Bruno turned to me with a gentle smile, and there was a wonderful look in his dark, kind eyes. He did me an injustice, for I too know what it is to have dreams. I have my visions too. In my way, I also am an artist. We were all silent for a while, and TR fished out of her capacious pocket a handful of cigarettes. She handed one to each of us, and we all three smoked. At last she said, Since monsieur is interested in Strickland, why do you not take him to see Dr. Coutras? He can tell him something about his illness and death. Volunteers, said the captain, looking at me. I thanked him, and he looked at his watch. It is past 6 o'clock. We should find him at home if you care to come now. I got up without further ado, and we walked along the road that led to the doctor's house. He lived out of the town, but the Hotel de la Fleur was on the edge of it, and we were quickly in the country. The broad road was shaded by pepper trees, and on each side were the plantations, coconut and vanilla. The pirate birds were screeching among the leaves of the palms. We came to a stone bridge over a shallow river, and we stopped for a few minutes to see the native boys bathing. They chased one another with shrill cries and laughter, and their bodies, brown and wet, gleamed in the sunlight. The Moon and Sixpence Live. As we walked along, I reflected on a circumstance which all that I had lately heard about Strickland forced on my attention. Here, on this remote island, he seemed to have aroused none of the detestation with which he was regarded at home, but compassion rather, and his vagaries were accepted with tolerance. To these people, native and European, he was a queer fish, but they were used to queer fish, and they took him for granted. The world was full of odd persons who did odd things, and perhaps they knew that a man is not what he wants to be, but what he must be. In England and France, he was the square peg in the round hole, but here the holes were any sort of shape, and no sort of peg was quite amiss. I do not think he was any gentler here, less selfish or less brutal, but the circumstances were more favorable. If he had spent his life amid these surroundings, he might have passed for no worse a man than another. He received here what he neither expected nor wanted among his own people: sympathy. I tried to tell Captain Bruno something of the astonishment with which this filled me, and for a little while he did not answer. "It is not strange that I, at all events, should have had sympathy for him," he said at last, "for, though perhaps neither of us knew it, we were both aiming at the same thing. What on earth can it be that two people so dissimilar as you and Strickland could aim at?" I asked, smiling. "Beauty. A large order," I murmured. "Do you know how men can be so obsessed by love that they are deaf and blind to everything else in the world? They are as little their own masters as the slaves chained to the benches of a galley. The passion that held Strickland in bondage was no less tyrannical than love." "How strange that you should say that," I answered. "For long ago I had the idea that he was possessed of a devil. And the passion that held Strickland was a passion to create beauty. It gave him no peace. It urged him hither and thither. He was eternally a pilgrim, haunted by a divine nostalgia, and the demon within him was ruthless. There are men whose desire for truth is so great that to attain it they will shatter the very foundation of their world. Of such was Strickland. Only beauty with him took the place of truth. I could only feel for him a profound compassion. That is strange also. A man whom he had deeply wronged told me that he felt a great pity for him. I was silent for a moment. I wonder if there you have found the explanation of a character which has always seemed to me inexplicable. How'd you hit on it?" He turned to me with a smile. "Did I not tell you that I, too, in my way, was an artist? I realized in myself the same desire as animated him. But whereas his medium was paint, mine has been life." Then Captain Bruno told me a story which I must repeat, since, if only by way of contrast, it adds something to my impression of Strickland. It has also to my mind a beauty of its own. Captain Bruno was a Breton and had been in the French Navy. He left it on his marriage, and settled down on a small property he had near Quimper to live for the rest of his days in peace. But the failure of an attorney left him suddenly penniless, and neither he nor his wife was willing to live in penury, where they had enjoyed consideration. During his seafaring days, he had cruised the South Seas, and he determined now to seek his fortune there. He spent some months in Papeete to make his plans and gain experience. Then, on money borrowed from a friend in France, he bought an island in the Paumotus. It was a ring of land round a deep lagoon, uninhabited and covered only with scrub and wild guava. With the intrepid woman who was his wife and a few natives, he landed there and set about building a house and clearing the scrub so that he could plant coconuts. That was 20 years before, and now what had been a barren island was a garden. It was hard and anxious work at first, and we worked strenuously, both of us. Every day, I was up at dawn, clearing, planting, working on my house, and at night when I threw myself on my bed, it was to sleep like a log till morning. My wife worked as hard as I did. Then children were born to us, first a son and then a daughter. My wife and I have taught them all they know. We had a piano sent out from France, and she has taught them to play and to speak English, and I have taught them Latin and mathematics, and we read history together. They can sail a boat. They can swim as well as the natives. There is nothing about the land of which they are ignorant. Our trees have prospered, and there is shell on my reef. I have come to Tahiti now to buy a schooner. I can get enough shell to make it worthwhile to fish for it, and who knows, I may find pearls. I have made something where there is nothing. I too have made beauty. Ah, you do not know what it is to look at those tall, healthy trees and think that every one I planted myself. Let me ask you the question that you asked Strickland. Do you never regret France and your old home in Brittany? Some day, when my daughter is married and my son has a wife and is able to take my place on the island, we shall go back and finish our days in the old house in which I was born. You will look back on a happy life, I said. Evidement, it is not exciting on my island, and we're very far from the world. Imagine, it takes me 4 days to come to Tahiti, but we are happy there. It is given to few men to attempt a work and to achieve it. Our life is simple and innocent. We are untouched by ambition, and what pride we have is due only to our contemplation of the work of our hands. Malice cannot touch us, nor envy attack. Ah, mon cher monsieur, they talk of the blessedness of labor, and it is a meaningless phrase, but to me it has the most intense significance. I'm a happy man. I'm sure you deserve to be, I smiled. I do not know how I have deserved to have a wife who is the perfect friend and helpmate, the perfect mistress, and the perfect mother. I reflected for a while on the life that the captain suggested to my imagination. It is obvious that to lead such an existence and make so great a success of it, you must both have needed a strong will and determined character. Perhaps, but without one other factor we could have achieved nothing. And what was that? He stopped, somewhat dramatically, and stretched out his arm. Belief in God. Without that we should have been lost. Then we arrived at the house of Dr. Coutras. The Moon and Sixpence LV. Dr. Coutras was an old Frenchman of great stature and exceeding bulk. His body was shaped like a huge duck's egg, and his eyes, sharp, blue, and good-natured, rested now and then with self-satisfaction on his enormous paunch. His complexion was florid and his hair white. He was a man to attract immediate sympathy. He received us in a room that might have been a house in a provincial town in France, and the one or two Polynesian curios had an odd look. He took my hand in both of his. They were huge, and he gave me a hearty look, in which, however, was great shrewdness. When he shook hands with Capitaine Bruno, he inquired politely after Madame E.T. Les Enfants. For some minutes, there was an exchange of courtesies and some local gossip about the island, the prospects of copra and the vanilla crop. Then we came to the object of my visit. I shall not tell what Dr. Coutras related to me in his words, but in my own, for I cannot hope to give at second hand any impression of his vivacious delivery. He had a deep, resonant voice, fitted to his massive frame, and a keen sense of the dramatic. To listen to him was, as the phrase goes, as good as a play, and much better than most. It appears that Dr. Coutras had gone one day to Taravao in order to see an old chiefess who was ill, and he gave a vivid picture of the obese old lady, lying in a huge bed, smoking cigarettes, and surrounded by a crowd of dark-skinned retainers. When he had seen her, he was taken into another room and given dinner, raw fish, fried bananas, and chicken. Cake, the typical dinner of the indigene. And while he was eating it, he saw a young girl being driven away from the door in tears. He thought nothing of it, but when he went out to get into his trap and drive home, he saw her again, standing a little way off. She looked at him with a woebegone air, and tears streamed down her cheeks. He asked someone what was wrong with her, and was told that she had come down from the hills to ask him to visit a white man who was sick. They had told her that the doctor could not be disturbed. He called her, and himself asked what she wanted. She told him that Ada was sent her, she who used to be at the Hotel de la Fleur, and that the Red One was ill. She thrust into his hand a crumpled piece of newspaper, and when he opened it, he found in it a 100-franc note. "Who is the Red One?" he asked of one of the bystanders. He was told that that was what they called the Englishman, a painter who lived with Ada up in the valley, 7 kilometers from where they were. He recognized Strickland by the description, but it was necessary to walk. It was impossible for him to go. That was why they had sent the girl away. "I confess," said the doctor, turning to me, "that I hesitated. I did not relish 14 kilometers over a bad pathway, and there was no chance that I could get back to Papeete that night. Besides, Strickland was not sympathetic to me. He was an idle, useless scoundrel, who preferred to live with a native woman rather than work for his living like the rest of us. Mon Dieu, how was I to know that one day the world would come to the conclusion that he had genius? I asked the girl if he was not well enough to have come down to see me. I asked her what she thought was the matter with him. She would not answer. I pressed her, angrily perhaps, but she looked down on the ground and began to cry. Then I shrugged my shoulders. After all, perhaps it was my duty to go, and in a very bad temper, I bade her lead the way. His temper was certainly no better when he arrived, perspiring freely and thirsty. Ada was on the lookout for him, and came a little way along the path to meet him. "Before I see anyone, give me something to drink, or I shall die of thirst," he cried out. "Pour l'amour de Dieu, give me a coconut," she called out, and a boy came running along. He swarmed up a tree, and presently threw down a ripe nut. Ada pierced a hole in it, and the doctor took a long, refreshing draught. Then he rolled himself a cigarette and felt in a better humor. "Now, where's the Red One?" he asked. "He is in the house, painting. I have not told him you were coming. Go in and see him." "But what does he complain of? If he is well enough to paint, he is well enough to have come down to Taravao and save me this confounded walk. I presume my time is no less valuable than his." Ada did not speak, but with the boy followed him to the house. The girl who had brought him was by this time sitting on the veranda, and here was lying an old woman, with her back to the wall, making native cigarettes. Ada pointed to the door. The doctor, wondering irritably why they behaved so strangely, entered, and there found Strickland cleaning his palette. There was a picture on the easel. Strickland, clad only in a perio, was standing with his back to the door, but he turned round when he heard the sound of boots. He gave the doctor a look of vexation. He was surprised to see him, and resented the intrusion. But the doctor gave a gasp, he was rooted to the floor, and he stared with all his eyes. This was not what he expected. He was seized with horror. "You enter without ceremony," said Strickland. "What can I do for you?" The doctor recovered himself, but it required quite an effort for him to find his voice. All his irritation was gone, and he felt, "Eh bien, oui, n'en pas." He felt an overwhelming pity. "I am Dr. Coutras. I was down at Taravao to see the chiefess. and Ada sent for me to see you. She's a damned fool. I have had a few aches and pains lately and a little fever, but that's nothing. It will pass off. Next time anyone went to Papeete, I was going to send for some quinine. Look at yourself in the glass. Strickland gave him a glance, smiled, and went over to a cheap mirror in a little wooden frame that hung on the wall. Well, do you not see a strange change in your face? Do you not see the thickening of your features and a look? How shall I describe it? The books call it lion-faced. Mon pauvre ami, must I tell you that you have a terrible disease? Aye. When you look at yourself in the glass, you see the typical appearance of the leper. You are jesting, said Strickland. I wish to God I were. Do you intend to tell me that I have leprosy? Unfortunately, there can be no doubt about it. Dr. Coutras had delivered sentence of death on many men, and he could never overcome the horror with which it filled him. He felt always the furious hatred that must seize a man condemned when he compared himself with a doctor, sane and healthy, who had the inestimable privilege of life. Strickland looked at him in silence. Nothing of emotion could be seen on his face, disfigured already by the loathsome disease. Do they know, he asked at last, pointing to the persons on the veranda, now sitting in unusual, unaccountable silence. These natives know the signs so well, said the doctor. They were afraid to tell you. Strickland stepped to the door and looked out. There must have been something terrible in his face, for suddenly they all burst out into loud cries and lamentation. They lifted up their voices and they wept. Strickland did not speak. After looking at them for a moment, he came back into the room. How long do you think I can last? Who knows? Sometimes the disease continues for 20 years. It is a mercy when it runs its course quickly. Strickland went to his easel and looked reflectively at the picture that stood on it. You have had a long journey. It is fitting that the bearer of important tidings should be rewarded. Take this picture. It means nothing to you now, but it may be that one day you will be glad to have it. Dr. Coutras protested that he needed no payment for his journey. He had already given back to Ada the 100-franc note, but Strickland insisted that he should take the picture. Then together they went out on the veranda. The natives were sobbing violently. Be quiet, woman. Dry thy tears, said Strickland, addressing Ada. There is no great harm. I shall leave thee very soon. They are not going to take thee away? She cried. At that time, there was no rigid sequestration on the islands, and lepers, if they chose, were allowed to go free. I shall go up into the mountain, said Strickland. Then Ada stood up and faced him. Let the others go if they choose, but I will not leave thee. Thou art my man, and I am thy woman. If thou leavest me, I shall hang myself on the tree that is behind the house. I swear by God. There was something immensely forcible in the way she spoke. She was no longer the meek, soft native girl, but a determined woman. She was extraordinarily transformed. Why shouldst thou stay with me? Thou canst go back to Papeete, and thou wilt soon find another white man. The old woman can take care of thy children, and TR will be glad to have thee back. Thou art my man, and I am thy woman. Whither thou goest, I will go too. For a moment Strickland's fortitude was shaken, and a tear filled each of his eyes and trickled slowly down his cheeks. Then he gave the sardonic smile which was usual with him. Women are strange little beasts, he said to Dr. Coutras. You can treat them like dogs, you can beat them till your arm aches, and still they love you. He shrugged his shoulders. Of course, it is one of the most absurd illusions of Christianity that they have souls. What is it that thou art saying to the doctor? Asked Ada, suspiciously. Thou wilt not go. If it please thee, I will stay, poor child. Ada flung herself on her knees before him, and clasped his legs with her arms, and kissed them. Strickland looked at Dr. Coutras with a faint smile. In the end they get you, and you are helpless in their hands. White or brown, they are all the same. Dr. Coutras felt that it was absurd to offer expressions of regret in so terrible a disaster, and he took his leave. Strickland told Taine, the boy, to lead him to the village. Dr. Coutras paused for a moment, and then he addressed himself to me. I did not like him. I have told you he was not sympathetic to me. But as I walked slowly down to Taraveo, I could not prevent an unwilling admiration for the stoical courage which enabled him to bear perhaps the most dreadful of human afflictions. When Taine left me, I told him I would send some medicine that might be of service. But my hope was small that Strickland would consent to take it, and even smaller that if he did, it would do him good. I gave the boy a message for Ada that I would come whenever she sent for me. Life is hard, and nature takes sometimes a terrible delight in torturing her children. It was with a heavy heart that I drove back to my comfortable home in Papeete. For a long time, none of us spoke. But Ada did not send for me, the doctor went on, at last, and it chanced that I did not go to that part of the island for a long time. I had no news of Strickland. Once or twice I heard that Ada had been to Papeete to buy painting materials, but I did not happen to see her. More than 2 years passed before I went to Taraveo again, and then it was once more to see the old chiefess. I asked them whether they had heard anything of Strickland. By now it was known everywhere that he had leprosy. First Tane, the boy, had left the house, and then, a little time afterwards, the old woman and her grandchild. Strickland and Ada were left alone with their babies. No one went near the plantation, for, as you know, the natives have a very lively horror of the disease, and in the old days when it was discovered the sufferer was killed. But sometimes, when the village boys were scrambling about the hills, they would catch sight of the white man, with his great red beard, wandering about. They fled in terror. Sometimes Ada would come down to the village at night and arouse the trader, so that he might sell her various things of which she stood in need. She knew that the natives looked upon her with the same horrified aversion as they looked upon Strickland, and she kept out of their way. Once some women, venturing nearer than usual to the plantation, saw her washing clothes in the brook, and they threw stones at her. After that the trader was told to give her the message that if she used the brook again men would come and burn down her house. Brutes, I said. Mais non, mon cher monsieur. Men are always the same. Fear makes them cruel. I decided to see Strickland, and when I had finished with the old chiefess, asked for a boy to show me the way. But none would accompany me, and I was forced to find it alone. When Dr. Coutras arrived at the plantation, he was seized with a feeling of uneasiness. Though he was hot from walking, he shivered. There was something hostile in the air which made him hesitate, and he felt that invisible forces barred his way. Unseen hands seemed to draw him back. No one would go near now to gather the coconuts, and they lay rotting on the ground. Everywhere was desolation. The bush was encroaching, and it looked as though very soon the primeval forest would regain possession of that strip of land which had been snatched from it at the cost of so much labor. He had the sensation that here was the abode of pain. As he approached the house, he was struck by the unearthly silence, and at first he thought it was deserted. Then he saw Ada. She was sitting on her haunches in the lean-to that served her as kitchen, watching some mess cooking in a pot. Near her a small boy was playing silently in the dirt. She did not smile when she saw him. "I have come to see Strickland," he said. "I will go and tell him." She went to the house, ascended the few steps that led to the veranda, and entered. Dr. Coutras followed her, but waited outside in obedience to her gesture. As she opened the door, he smelt the sickly sweet smell which makes the neighborhood of the leper nauseous. He heard her speak, and then he heard Strickland's answer, but he did not recognize the voice. It had become hoarse and indistinct. Dr. Coutras raised his eyebrows. He judged that the disease had already attacked the vocal cords. Then Ada came out again. "He will not see you. You must go away." Dr. Coutras insisted, but she would not let him pass. Dr. Coutras shrugged his shoulders, and after a moment's reflection, turned away. She walked with him. He felt that she, too, wanted to be rid of him. "Is there nothing I can do at all?" he asked. "You can send him some paints," she said. "There is nothing else he wants." "Can he paint still?" "He is painting the walls of the house." "This is a terrible life for you, my poor child." Then at last she smiled, and there was in her eyes a look of superhuman love. Dr. Coutras was startled by it, and amazed. And he was awed. He found nothing to say. "He is my man," she said. "Where is your other child?" he asked. "When I was here last you had two." "Yes, it died. We buried it under the mango." When Ada had gone with him a little way, she said she must turn back. Dr. Coutras surmised she was afraid to go farther in case she met any of the people from the village. He told her again that if she wanted him, she had only to send, and he would come at once. The Moon and Sixpence LVI, then 2 years more went by, or perhaps 3, for time passes imperceptibly in Tahiti, and it is hard to keep count of it. But at last a message was brought to Dr. Coutras that Strickland was dying. Ada had waylaid the cart that took the mail into Papeete and besought the man who drove it to go at once to the doctor. But the doctor was out when the summons came, and it was evening when he received it. It was impossible to start at so late an hour, and so it was not till next day soon after dawn that he set out. He arrived at Taraveo, and for the last time tramped the 7 kilometers that led to Ada's house. The path was overgrown, and it was clear that for years now it had remained all but untrodden. It was not easy to find the way. Sometimes he had to stumble along the bed of the stream, and sometimes he had to push through shrubs, dense and thorny. Often he was obliged to climb over rocks in order to avoid the hornet nest that hung on the trees over his head. The silence was intense. It was with a sigh of relief that at last he came upon the little unpainted house, extraordinarily bedraggled now, and unkempt. But here, too, was the same intolerable silence. He walked up, and a little boy, playing unconcernedly in the sunshine, started at his approach and fled quickly away. To him, the stranger was the enemy. Dr. Coutras had a sense that the child was stealthily watching him from behind a tree. The door was wide open. He called out, but no one answered. He stepped in. He knocked at a door, but again there was no answer. He turned the handle and entered. The stench that assailed him turned him horribly sick. He put his handkerchief to his nose and forced himself to go in. The light was dim, and after the brilliant sunshine for a while he could see nothing. Then he gave a start. He could not make out where he was. He seemed on a sudden to have entered a magic world. He had a vague impression of a great primeval forest and of naked people walking beneath the trees. Then he saw that there were paintings on the walls. Mon Dieu, I hope the sun hasn't affected me, he muttered. A slight movement attracted his attention, and he saw that Ada was lying on the floor, sobbing quietly. Ada, he called. Ada. She took no notice. Again, the beastly stench almost made him faint, and he lit a cheroot. His eyes grew accustomed to the darkness, and now he was seized by an overwhelming sensation as he stared at the painted walls. He knew nothing of pictures, but there was something about these that extraordinarily affected him. From floor to ceiling, the walls were covered with a strange and elaborate composition. It was indescribably wonderful and mysterious. It took my breath away. It filled him with an emotion which he could not understand or analyze. He felt the awe and the delight which a man might feel who watched the beginning of a world. It was tremendous, sensual, passionate, and yet there was something horrible there too, something which made him afraid. It was the work of a man who had delved into the hidden depths of nature and had discovered secrets which were beautiful and fearful too. It was the work of a man who knew things which it is unholy for men to know. There was something primeval there and terrible. It was not human. It brought to my mind vague recollections of black magic. It was beautiful and obscene. Mon Dieu, this is genius. The words were wrung from him, and he did not know he had spoken. Then his eyes fell on the bed of mats in the corner, and he went up, and he saw the dreadful, mutilated, ghastly object which had been Strickland. He was dead. Dr. Coutras made an effort of will and bent over that battered horror. Then he started violently, and terror blazed in his heart, for he felt that someone was behind him. It was Ada. He had not heard her get up. She was standing at his elbow, looking at what he looked at. Good heavens, my nerves are all distraught, he said. You nearly frightened me out of my wits. He looked again at the poor, dead thing that had been man, and then he started back in dismay. But he was blind. Yes, he had been blind for nearly a year. The Moon and Sixpence LVII. At that moment, we were interrupted by the appearance of Madame Coutras, who had been paying visits. She came in, like a ship in full sail, an imposing creature, tall and stout, with an ample bust and an obesity girthed in alarmingly by straight-fronted corsets. She had a bold-hooked nose and 3 chins. She held herself upright. She had not yielded for an instant to the enervating charm of the tropics, but contrariwise was more active, more worldly, more decided than anyone in a temperate clime would have thought it possible to be. She was evidently a copious talker, and now poured forth a breathless stream of anecdote and comment. She made the conversation we had just seem far away and unreal. Presently Dr. Coutras turned to me. I still have in my bureau the picture that Strickland gave me, he said. Would you like to see it? Willingly. We got up, and he led me on to the veranda which surrounded his house. We paused to look at the gay flowers that rioted in his garden. For a long time I could not get out of my head the recollection of the extraordinary decoration with which Strickland had covered the walls of his house, he said reflectively. I have been thinking of it too. It seemed to me that here Strickland had finally put the whole expression of himself. Working silently, knowing that it was his last chance, I fancied that here he must have said all that he knew of life and all that he divined. And I fancied that perhaps here he had at last found peace. The demon which possessed him was exorcised at last, and with the completion of the work, for which all his life had been a painful preparation, rest descended on his remote and tortured soul. He was willing to die, for he had fulfilled his purpose. What was the subject? I asked. I scarcely know. It was strange and fantastic. It was a vision of the beginnings of the world, the Garden of Eden, with Adam and Eve. It was a hymn to the beauty of the human form, male and female, and the praise of nature, sublime, indifferent, lovely, and cruel. It gave you an awful sense of the infinity of space and of the endlessness of time, because he painted the trees I see about me every day, the coconuts, the banyans, the flamboyants, the alligator pears. I have seen them ever since differently, as though there were in them a spirit and a mystery which I am ever on the point of seizing and which forever escapes me. The colors were the colors familiar to me, and yet they were different. They had a significance which was all their own. And those nude men and women, they were of the earth, the clay of which they were created, and at the same time something divine. You saw man in the nakedness of his primeval instincts, and you were afraid, for you saw yourself. Dr. Coutras shrugged his shoulders and smiled. You will laugh at me. I am a materialist, and I am a gross, fat man. Falstaff, the lyrical mode does not become me. I make myself ridiculous, but I have never seen painting which made so deep an impression upon me. Tennis, I had just the same feeling as when I went to the Sistine Chapel in Rome. There too, I was awed by the greatness of the man who had painted that ceiling. It was genius, and it was stupendous and overwhelming. I felt small and insignificant. But you are prepared for the greatness of Michelangelo. Nothing had prepared me for the immense surprise of these pictures in a native hut, far away from civilization, in a fold of the mountain above Taraveo. And Michelangelo is sane and healthy. Those great works of his have the calm of the sublime. But here, notwithstanding beauty, was something troubling. I did not know what it was. It made me uneasy. It gave me the impression you get when you're sitting next door to a room that you know is empty, but in which, you know not why, you have a dreadful consciousness that notwithstanding there is someone. You scold yourself. You know it is only your nerves, and yet. In a little, while it is impossible to resist the terror that seizes you, and you are helpless in the clutch of an unseen horror. Yes, I confess I was not altogether sorry when I heard that those strange masterpieces had been destroyed. Destroyed? I cried. Mais oui, did you not know? How should I know? It is true, I had never heard of this work, but I thought perhaps it had fallen into the hands of a private owner. Even now, there is no certain list of Strickland's paintings. When he grew blind, he would sit hour after hour in those 2 rooms that he had painted, looking at his works with sightless eyes, and seeing, perhaps, more than he ever had seen in his life before. Ada told me that he never complained of his fate, he never lost courage. To the end his mind remained serene and undisturbed. But he made her promise that when she had buried him, did I tell you that I dug his grave with my own hands, for none of the natives would approach the infected house, and we buried him, she and I, sewn up in 3 parios joined together, under the mango tree. He made her promise that she would set fire to the house and not leave it till it was burned to the ground and not a stick remained. I did not speak for a while, for I was thinking. Then I said, he remained the same to the end, then. Do you understand? I must tell you that I thought it my duty to dissuade her. Even after what you have just said? Yes, for I knew that here was a work of genius, and I did not think we had the right to deprive the world of it. But Ada would not listen to me. She had promised. I would not stay to witness the barbarous deed, and it was only afterwards that I heard what she had done. She poured paraffin on the dry floors and on the pandanus mats, and then she set fire. In a little while nothing remained but smoldering embers, and a great masterpiece existed no longer. I think Strickland knew it was a masterpiece. He had achieved what he wanted. His life was complete. He had made a world and saw that it was good. Then in pride and contempt, he destroyed it. But I must show you my picture, said Dr. Coutras, moving on. What happened to Ada and the child? They went to the Marquesas. She had relations there. I have heard that the boy works on one of Cameron's schooners. They say he is very like his father in appearance. At the door that led from the veranda to the doctor's consulting room, he paused and smiled. It is a fruit piece. You would think it not a very suitable picture for a doctor's consulting room, but my wife will not have it in the drawing room. She says it is frankly obscene. A fruit piece, I exclaimed in surprise. We entered the room, and my eyes fell at once on the picture. I looked at it for a long time. It was a pile of mangoes, bananas, oranges, and I know not what. And at first sight, it was an innocent picture enough. It would have been passed in an exhibition of the post-impressionists by a careless person as an excellent, but not very remarkable example of the school. But perhaps afterwards it would come back to his recollection, and he would wonder why. I did not think then he could ever entirely forget it. The colors were so strange that words can hardly tell what a troubling emotion they gave. There were somber blues, opaque like a delicately carved bowl in lapis lazuli, and yet with a quivering luster that suggested the palpitation of mysterious life. There were purples, horrible like raw and putrid flesh, and yet with a glowing, sensual passion that called up vague memories of the Roman Empire of Heliogabalus. There were reds, shrill like the berries of holly. One thought of Christmas in England, and the snow, the good cheer, and the pleasure of children, and yet by some magic softened till they had the swooning tenderness of a dove's breast. There were deep yellows that died with an unnatural passion into a green as fragrant as the spring and as pure as the sparkling water of a mountain brook. Who can tell what anguished fancy made these fruits? They belonged to a Polynesian garden of the Hesperides. There was something strangely alive in them, as though they were created in a stage of the earth's dark history when things were not irrevocably fixed to their forms. They were extravagantly luxurious. They were heavy with tropical odors. They seemed to possess a somber passion of their own. It was enchanted fruit, to taste which might open the gateway to God knows what secrets of the soul and to mysterious palaces of the imagination. They were sullen with unawaited dangers, and to eat them might turn a man to beast or god. All that was healthy and natural, all that clung to happy relationships and the simple joys of simple men, shrunk from them in dismay. And yet a fearful attraction was in them, and, like the fruit on the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, They were terrible with the possibilities of the unknown. At last I turned away. I felt that Strickland had kept his secret to the grave. Voyons, Renee, mon ami, came the loud, cheerful voice of Madame Coutras. What are you doing all this time? Iras apéritif. Ask monsieur if he will not drink a little glass of quinquina Dubonnet. Volunteers, madam, I said, going out onto the veranda. The spell was broken. The Moon and Sixpence LVII, the time came for my departure from Tahiti. According to the gracious custom of the island, presents were given me by the persons with whom I had been thrown in contact. Baskets made of the leaves of the coconut tree, mats of pandanus, fans, and T.R. gave me 3 little pearls and 3 jars of guava jelly made with her own plump hands. When the mailboat, stopping for 24 hours on its way from Wellington to San Francisco, blew the whistle that warned the passengers to get on board, T.R. clasped me to her vast bosom, so that I seemed to sink into a billowy sea and pressed her red lips to mine. Tears glistened in her eyes, and when we steamed slowly out of the lagoon, making our way gingerly through the opening in the reef, and then steered for the open sea, a certain melancholy fell upon me. The breeze was laden still with the pleasant odors of the land. Tahiti is very far away, and I knew that I should never see it again. A chapter of my life was closed, and I felt a little nearer to inevitable death. Not much more than a month later, I was in London, and after I had arranged certain matters which claimed my immediate attention, thinking Mrs. Strickland might like to hear what I knew of her husband's last years, I wrote to her. I had not seen her since long before the war, and I had to look out her address in the telephone book. She made an appointment, and I went to the trim little house on Campden Hill, which she now inhabited. She was by this time a woman of hard on 60, but she bore her years well, and no one would have taken her for more than 50. Her face, thin and not much lined, was of the sort that ages gracefully, so that you thought in youth she must have been a much handsomer woman than in fact she was. Her hair, not yet very gray, was becomingly arranged, and her black gown was modish. I remembered having heard that her sister, Mrs. McAndrew, outliving her husband but a couple of years, had left money to Mrs. Strickland, and by the look of the house and the trim maid who opened the door, I judged that it was a sum adequate to keep the widow in modest comfort. When I was ushered into the drawing room, I found that Mrs. Strickland had a visitor, and when I discovered who he was, I guessed that I had been asked to come at just that time not without intention. The caller was Mr. Van Bush Taylor, an American, and Mrs. Strickland gave me particulars with a charming smile of apology to him. You know, we English are so dreadfully ignorant. You must forgive me if it's necessary to explain. Then she turned to me. Mr. Van Bush Taylor is the distinguished American critic. If you haven't read his book, your education has been shamefully neglected, and you must repair the omission at once. He's writing something about Dear Charlie, and he's come to ask me if I can help him. Mr. Van Bush Taylor was a very thin man with a large, bald head, bony and shining, and under the great dome of his skull his face, yellow, with deep lines in it, looked very small. He was quiet and exceedingly polite. He spoke with the accent of New England, and there was about his demeanor a bloodless frigidity which made me ask myself why on earth he was busying himself with Charles Strickland. I had been slightly tickled at the gentleness which Mrs. Strickland put into her mention of her husband's name, and while the pair conversed, I took stock of the room in which we sat. Mrs. Strickland had moved with the times. Gone were the Morris papers, and gone the severe crotons. Gone were the Arundel prints that had adorned the walls of her drawing room in Ashley Gardens. The room blazed with fantastic color, and I wondered if she knew that those varied hues, which fashion had imposed upon her, were due to the dreams of a poor painter in a South Sea island. She gave me the answer herself. "What wonderful cushions you have," said Mr. Van Bush Taylor. "Do you like them?" she said, smiling. "Bakst, you know." And yet on the walls were colored reproductions of several of Strickland's best pictures, due to the enterprise of a publisher in Berlin. "You're looking at my pictures," she said, following my eyes. "Of course, the originals are out of my reach, but it's a comfort to have these. The publisher sent them to me himself. They're a great consolation to me." "They must be very pleasant to live with," said Mr. Van Bush Taylor. "Yes, they're so essentially decorative." "That is one of my profoundest convictions," said Mr. Van Bush Taylor. "Great art is always decorative." Their eyes rested on a nude woman suckling a baby, while a girl was kneeling by their side, holding out a flower to the indifferent child. Looking over them was a wrinkled, scraggy hag. It was Strickland's version of the Holy Family. I suspected that for the figures had sat his household above Taraveo, and the woman and the baby were Ada and his first son. I asked myself if Mrs. Strickland had any inkling of the facts. The conversation proceeded, and I marveled at the tact with which Mr. Van Bush Taylor avoided all subjects that might have been the least embarrassing, and at the ingenuity with which Mrs. Strickland, without saying a word that was untrue, insinuated that her relations with her husband had always been perfect. At last Mr. Van Bush Taylor rose to go. Holding his hostess's hand, he made her a graceful, though perhaps too elaborate, speech of thanks, and left us. I hope he didn't bore you, she said, when the door closed behind him. Of course it's a nuisance sometimes, but I feel it's only right to give people any information I can about Charlie. There's a certain responsibility about having been the wife of a genius. She looked at me with those pleasant eyes of hers, which had remained as candid and as sympathetic as they had been more than 20 years before. I wondered if she was making a fool of me. Of course you've given up your business? I said. Oh yes, she answered airily. I ran it more by way of a hobby than for any other reason, and my children persuaded me to sell it. They thought I was overtaxing my strength. I saw that Mrs. Strickland had forgotten that she had ever done anything so disgraceful as to work for her living. She had the true instinct of a nice woman that it is only really decent for her to live on other people's money. They're here now, she said. I thought they'd like to hear what you had to say about their father. You remember Robert, don't you? I'm glad to say he's been recommended for the Military Cross. She went to the door and called them. There entered a tall man in khaki with a parson's collar, handsome in a somewhat heavy fashion, but with the frank eyes that I remembered in him as a boy. He was followed by his sister. She must have been the same age as was her mother when first I knew her, and she was very like her. She too gave one the impression that, as a girl, she must have been prettier than indeed she was. I suppose you don't remember them in the least, said Mrs. Strickland, proud and smiling. My daughter is now Mrs. Ronaldson. Her husband's a major in the gunners. He's by way of being a puckus soldier, you know, said Mrs. Ronaldson gaily. That's why he's only a major. I remembered my anticipation long ago that she would marry a soldier. It was inevitable. She had all the graces of the soldier's wife. She was civil and affable, but she could hardly conceal her intimate conviction that she was not quite as others were. Robert was breezy. It's a bit of luck that I should be in London when you turned up, he said. I've only got 3 days leave. He's dying to get back, said his mother. Well, I don't mind confessing it. I have a rattling good time at the front. I made a lot of good pals. It's a first-rate life. Of course, war's terrible and all that sort of thing, but it does bring out the best qualities in a man. There's no denying that. Then I told them what I had learnt about Charles Strickland in Tahiti. I thought it unnecessary to say anything of Ada and her boy, but for the rest, I was as accurate as I could be. When I had narrated his lamentable death, I ceased. For a minute or two, we were all silent. Then Robert Strickland struck a match and lit a cigarette. The mills of God grind slowly, but they grind exceeding small, he said, somewhat impressively. Mrs. Strickland and Mrs. Ronaldson looked down with a slightly pious expression which indicated, I felt sure, that they thought the quotation was from Holy Writ. Indeed, I was unconvinced that Robert Strickland did not share their illusion. I did not know why I suddenly thought of Strickland's son by Ada. They had told me he was a merry, light-hearted youth. I saw him, with my mind's eye, on the schooner on which he worked, wearing nothing but a pair of dungarees, and at night, when the boat sailed along easily before a light breeze, and the sailors were gathered on the upper deck, while the captain and the supercargo lolled in deck chairs, smoking their pipes, I saw him dance with another lad, dance wildly, to the wheezy music of the concertina. Above was the blue sky and the stars, and all about the desert of the Pacific Ocean. A quotation from the Bible came to my lips, but I held my tongue, for I know that clergymen think it a little blasphemous when the laity poach upon their preserves. My uncle Henry, for 27 years vicar of Whitstable, was on these occasions in the habit of saying that the devil could always quote scripture to his purpose. He remembered the days when you could get 13 Royal Natives for a shilling.